So let's talk about the IEP, or the Individual Education Program. So we're going to go over a few things today. We want to be able to identify some key resources for developing IEPs, the key parts of the IEP, the role of student data in that process. We're going to focus pretty specifically on present levels and measurable goals, and also look at SAS and SDI and progress monitoring. So for you today, we're going to start with identifying key resources for developing the IEP. Now, last week you were given a document with the guidance documents for Mississippi, New York, Kentucky, Colorado, and Ohio. So you can think back to that or look back at those to see what was there. But we're going to consider those as we're identifying those key parts of the IEP. So let's start here. When we think about the IEP development process, what you'll notice here is the cyclical nature of this. We always start at that bottom where it says ongoing progress monitoring, because even before students are identified for special education services, we've already been engaging in ongoing progress monitoring through MTSS or RTI, however our district labels it, but we've already been gathering that information. And then once we begin that process, it looks a little bit differently. So we start down here with our ongoing progress monitoring, and we've got, this is that start. We start with our present level or IEP development process. We start with those present levels, and then we move on to special factors, measurable annual goals, specially designed instruction, supplementary aids and services, accommodations. We look at program modifications and supports for school personnel, participation in the general education curriculum, and the least restrictive environment, and then what does it look like if the student needs school year services. So you'll see then also we're also considering transition services for post-secondary goals as well. And this process just continues over and over again annually for students. This red, this ongoing progress monitoring, that's our baseline. That's our baseline data that we always have as we move forward. So we've got a whole lot of key components that I just listed off in our IEP. And if you want to look in the Ohio Model Policies and Procedures, you'll see the specifics there on page 32. So you can look back at that. So we're thinking about, what is this IEP all about? We are starting with the student in the center, and these four areas are pretty much what revolves around the student: the strengths of the student, related services, and SAS, our specially designed instruction, or SDI, and our goals. When we think about that, we've got the student, right? And we say, well, what's in the student's bag in terms of what they're taking to school? So when we're looking at that IEP, we're kind of putting it all together. Eligibility is that bag that holds it all together. Students have to be eligible for special education services based on the fact that they have a disability that impedes their ability to make progress in the general education curriculum. So that's the key. Not every student with a disability has an IEP, but every student with an IEP does have a disability. So that eligibility is key. That's what holds it all together. And based on their eligibility, that's how we're looking at what kind of goals they have. We're going to get their present level data, and then we're going to design SAS and SDI based on the eligibility and the present levels, continue gathering data, and have some special factors that we'll consider as well. We'll talk about those. So we want to make sure that we can identify the role of student data in the IEP process. And I mentioned that area of eligibility, which means we need to see present levels and goals that match the eligibility. So if a student qualifies or is eligible for services based on emotional and behavior needs, then if they're eligible for EBD, then that's what we need to see in their present levels and goals. If a student is getting services because they have a learning disability in math, then we need to see present levels about math, and we need to see goals about math. Those need to match. We need to have some guiding questions about the present levels, where we need to look to see if we address those special factors that come up in the student levels. So let's talk about those present levels. The present levels, this is a fundamental component of the IEP, the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Sometimes it's called a PLEP, present levels of performance. Sometimes it's called a PLAF, or again, present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Your state and district documentation is going to vary in this, depending on how it's worded. In some PLAF statements are going to be written as a single comprehensive summary that covers all the areas in which the student needs support, but others are going to be written as multiple smaller descriptions that address each area of need separately. But regardless of how it's organized, the PLAF statement has to contain information for each identified area of need based on the results of the student evaluation. Remember, that was the second step in that IEP process, was that evaluation. The PLAF statement serves as this foundation for all other components on which the IEP is built. At a minimum, the PLAF has to describe the student's need in an academic and/or functional skill area. It has to specifically state the impact of the student's disability on her involvement in the general education curriculum, and it has to document the student's current level of performance. This is going to serve as our baseline data to measure any subsequent progress. And these present levels inform our annual goals and the appropriate special education services and supports required to meet those goals. So I just wanted to go back again. Some districts will want this noted at each area of concern, right? So it's individually, and others will want a summary statement. You'll just need to check with your district to see how they want it organized. The content is the same, but they may want it organized differently. I want to look just for a moment at some common errors that we see when we're writing present levels and annual goals. With regard to test scores, we often see an over-reliance on test scores from the initial and the 3-year special education evaluation. Another error is vague descriptions. These are really vague descriptions about how the disability affects involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. And then finally, another big error is there's often an absence of appropriate baseline data for developing the PLAF and the annual goals. When we're talking about academic achievement, we're referring to a child's performance in the academic areas like reading, language arts, and math. Or for preschool children, we're talking about age-appropriate developmental levels. When we're talking about functional performance, we're talking about skills and activities that aren't considered academic or related to a child's academic achievement. It's usually in the context of routine activities of everyday living, and it varies depending on the individual needs of the child. We have to remember, though, that functional performance can impact educational achievement. And then we've got some rules about the PLAF. The PLAF must be current, it's got to be relevant, it has to be objective, measurable, and understandable, because this has to provide an accurate picture of what the student can and cannot do in a specific academic or functional area. That's how we establish that baseline for progress monitoring. In order to develop an appropriate present level statement, the current baseline and progress monitoring data are needed for this, and we have to include it in that. When we talk about that relevance, this means it's related to the skill area. We have to talk about the child's disability category, or talking about the child's disability category is not necessarily relevant. What's relevant are the needs and support. So it may be important to know that a child has autism or a child has a learning disability, but what we really want to focus on are what are the individual needs in that skill area that are based on that disability. It has to be objective, which means this is based not on what somebody thinks, but on the data. So it can't just be based on someone thinks the student's not making progress. They have to bring data that shows the student isn't making progress. And number 4, this measurable, again, this has to do with data. It has to be something countable. You can't just say that the student has a hard time or the student makes a solid attempt. You have to have something that we can count, that we can measure. So we could say they attempt to answer this number of responses given a certain number of responses or something like that. And then understandable, it has to be jargon-free. We can't just reiterate the scores and post them again. We have to clearly explain what the child can do and what the child can't do. Now here's language from the law, or the guidance document, that this PLAF is a statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement, how the disability affects, and then for preschool children we can look at developmental progress as well. And we've actually already talked about this. So and this as well. All right, the major components, again, data-based, strengths of the students, the needs resulting from the disability, and the effects of the disability on the general education curriculum. I can't stress enough how important it is that we write our present levels from a strength-based perspective. We want to say this is what our students can do. I recognize that the students are receiving special education services from a disability, so inherently that means there are things they can't do, and that's fine. We're not pretending that they can do everything if they haven't learned to do those skills consistently yet. But we want to identify what their skills are. So if we have a student who is in 8th grade, and maybe they're reading on like a 1st or 2nd grade level, instead of saying he can't read on grade level, we want to say this student can consistently read text that's written at a 1st grade level at a rate of 87 correct words per minute with less than 3 errors. We want to be specific about what he or she can do, and that in and of itself will let us know what he or she can't do. Again, the objective measurable terms, when we're writing this, we've got to use the data, and we can use test scores that are relevant if it's appropriate. We don't always have to have all of that. We don't have to always include an IQ test if that's not relevant to what we're looking at in terms of struggles. In terms of where do we get this data, because we have to have it, we can actually use a variety of sources. It can come from current relevant formal evaluation, like our testing, our standardized testing, and then also our testing that our school psychologist is going to do. But it can also be classroom or curriculum-based assessments. We can use observations, we can use supporting anecdotal records, work samples, progress that they made towards last year's goals. If the parents have presented concerns and we have this documented, we can use that as part of our data. The students' desired school or post-school outcome goals and input from any of the related service providers that the student works with. We definitely want to reflect on the strengths of the student. We want to reflect specific skills or behaviors that the student has mastered, or specific skills in which the student performs well for the domain or target area. When we're talking about those needs resulting from a disability, that's that other component that we address. Needs are determined by consideration of the important skills and behaviors that are critical for the student to learn in order to be able to participate and make progress in the general curriculum. When we talk about special factors, these are the needs that are addressed through goals, supports, and services or accommodation. And then we've got those effects of the disability. The PLAF describes how the disability impacts the student's involvement in the general curriculum. We want to convey the unique challenges or barriers that do exist for the student as a result of the disability. And we want to describe the current level of independence and any need for assistance. So this is really important for us to do. We want to also, when we write this, don't assume that the other teachers who are going to read this document, right, the other gen ed teachers, don't assume they have knowledge of different disabilities. They may or may not realize that certain demands placed on students might create a barrier for the student. So certain skills may need to be taught, whether those are academic or functional, or specific accommodations or modifications might be needed. And the impact may cross over multiple content areas or multiple settings. Any class that relies on text-driven assignments has to have or will have an adverse effect on the student who's got a reading disability. So we might say this is really important if the student has a reading disability, that the science content teacher and the social studies content teacher or any other content area that they're taking, the class that they're taking, if it relies heavily on text, we've got to make sure those teachers understand how the reading disability affects that student. So reading written assignments on the board, reading questions on a written exam, all of this needs to be explicit in the IEP. The present levels of academic and functional performance answers where does the child stand in terms of academic and functional performance, and how does the child's disability affect his or her involvement and progress in the general curriculum. So this is the general information for the law, but when you go back to your district, these are the questions you need to ask in your district. What are the state and district standards of expectation? What are the general classroom and grade level expectations? What are the instructional strategies or approaches that are currently being used in the general classroom? And what are the social and emotional expectations at the grade level? Extracurricular activities or events that are a part of school life for the students at this grade level. So you'll need to go back to your districts and say, well, what is it like with these different things here? And then we've got to connect those IEPs to the state or district standards. And this means referring to the standards to determine the expectations at grade level. So we don't just put the language of we don't just write in the standard in our goals, but we use that information from the standards to say what's the expectation for the grade level. We want to use those standards to guide us in determining what's important for the student to learn or to be able to do, and to conduct an analysis to determine the gap between the grade level expectations and the student's current knowledge and skills. So a critical point here is that the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance are the cornerstone of the IEP. It's the source that drives other IEP components, and it's the statement that links together all of the components of the IEP. I can't stress enough, the present levels must be data-driven, and that's key to address how it impacts the student, and we must note the strength-based. It has to be a strength-based present level. One of the phrases that you can use is relative strength. It's a key phrase. In our needs and concerns are always data-driven in our district-wide assessments. But we want to say, well, what are the relative strengths of this student? All right, so just briefly, we'll talk about some measurable annual goals and identifying when and how SDI and SAS are used. So our measurable annual goals must relate directly to the present levels. Those things have to match. So if it's in the present levels, then we need to have a goal for it. And if we have a goal for it, it better be in the present levels. And this has to meet an academic or other educational need that results directly from the disability. And it has to have these components. And we do this A, B, C, D, E, F so that we remember the audience, which means the student's name. So who's the audience for this goal? What's the specific behavior? What are the circumstances under which they will do this behavior? To what degree or to what criteria? How will we evaluate it? And what's the frequency of our data collection? All right, so it looks like this, right? If we've got, here are our goals, we want to have 3 to 5 goals typically. There's our A, B, C, D, E, F. So we need to be able to provide evidence of progress monitoring and data collection for each annual goal to show how the student's progress toward meeting the annual goal is being measured. So this is how we can get this information. Data collection has to match the frequency defined in the goal, and the data points need to have dates. And you need to be sure to collect and keep data or evidence of progress monitoring or analysis. This could be through a cumulative graph, it could be through charts, it could be a checklist, it could be whatever that you want. Okay, so let's look. But remember that we have to have evidence of that progress monitoring, and it must be reflected and match the baseline data. So if in our present levels you used curriculum-based assessments to measure reading fluency, then you need to use those same curriculum or the same style of assessment when you do your progress monitoring. So it's going to show up again and again. Every student's data is based on their age or grade level requirement. If it's pre-K, for pre-K and grade level for school age. And then the standard is your target destination. And then your approach. We always want to approach from that least dangerous assumption, and we should be using the guardian, involving the guardian in this. All right, so let's look just a little bit. We've got audience behavior, circumstances, degree, criteria, evaluation, and frequency. So if this was our statement when given 20 content-related vocabulary words, Kara will orally define 18 out of 20 words correctly for 4 consecutive probes as measured by a weekly checklist. Here's what it's going to look like. Our audience is Kara. That's who we're talking about. The behavior that we are going to be measuring is whether or not she's orally defining the words. Under what circumstances? When I give her 20 content-related vocabulary words. And to what degree or criteria she needs to get 18 out of 20 words correct. How are we going to measure this? We're going to use a checklist. And how often are we going to do it? Weekly. Okay, so that's what it's going to look like. I'm going to give you a link, or I'll give you this document in Pilot, but some examples of goals, of words that we can use that measure specific behaviors, frequency words, circumstance words, degree words, and evaluation words, okay? With our measurable annual goals in the IEP, these are statements that describe what a child with a disability can reasonably be expected to accomplish within the duration of the IEP. The primary concerns that are stated in the present levels of academic and functional performance. We've also got to address the amount of time the student has left in the school and the age of the student, any skills needed to progress to the next level of performance, skills needed to achieve transition, behavior and skills that will improve with modification. When we're looking at this definition of measurable, that means when compared to the data in the present level of academic achievement and functional performances, the goal contains specific expectations of attainment. So this is going to be something like this. It reveals what to do to measure whether the goal has been accomplished. It yields the same conclusion if measured by several people. So that's how we know that this is objectively measurable. It allows us to know how much progress has been made since the last measured performance, and a measurable goal can be measured as written without any additional information. Anybody who looks at the IEP that you wrote should be able to understand what they're measuring and how they're going to do it based on just reading what you've written there. And measurable goals contain givens, if necessary, like the learner performance and the criterion, the level of performance that is reached. If you can't measure what's written, then it's not a measurable goal. For example, if you've got whether a student can count to 10 without error, whether a student can count to 10 without error can be readily determined as it's stated, but will improve counting skills cannot be assessed without additional information. So it has to be measurable or it's not going to work. Some of the major components of these goals means we've got to give any important givens or considerations: the when, with, what, where as applicable, what skill or domain area, whether it's academic, behavioral, or functional, an observable learner performance. That means what's the learner going to be doing? What's the action that we're observing? And the measurable criteria which specify the level at which the student's performance will be acceptable. So at what speed do they have to read? At what level of accuracy? At what frequency do they have to read? If you can close your eyes and see it, then it's measurable. Reading orally is measurable. Improving something is not measurable. The criterion or level of performance, this is how well the learner has to do. So frequently used examples of criteria are things like 4 out of 5 trials, 3 consecutive days, or % accuracy. Observable means it's clearly defined, it's visible, it's accountable behavior. Sometimes people will say, like, does this observable behavior pass the dead man's test? And the dead man's test means if a dead man can do it, it's not a behavior, right? Because the dead man can't do anything. All right, measurable annual goals. Examples of observable behavior would be reading orally, dressing oneself, speaking to adults without vulgarities, pointing, drawing, identifying, or writing, things like that. But non-examples of observable behavior would be becoming independent, respecting authority, enjoying literature, improving, feeling, or knowing. None of those things are things that we can observe or actually measure. All right, so that's the idea that we'll be able to develop measurable annual goals. I want to stress that when we go on from goals to our special factors, these still also must match the needs and concerns in the present level. So hopefully what you're seeing here is that everything we do goes back to those present levels every single time. So then when we've got all those goals and we've got our special factors, then we start looking at our specially designed instruction. And we've got a section where we talk about specially designed instruction and SAS. Okay, so we've got those these other things, these aids and supports, aids and supports for the services. One way you can think of this as your SDI is the lifeguard, right? This is what the lifeguard does to save your life when you are drowning. And the SAS, these are our supports and accommodations. This is the life raft or the life preserver that we send out to help students. So many of the instructional strategies and supports suggested that we'll suggest can be both SDI and SAS. In order for the student to access and use supplementary aids and services independently, the student often needs to be provided explicit instruction, which would be an SDI, in the area of the strategy or device. So the intent is to provide scaffolded support until the student can access the supplementary aid independently. So for instance, just to be clear, SDI is what the teacher does, not the para, not a parent volunteer, not a peer tutor, not a classmate. Only the teacher does SDI. They do the instruction, they do the assessment, they reteach, adapt, they address unique needs, and what they do is provide access to the general curriculum for a student with a disability. Specially designed instruction must be provided by a certified professional. This is an intervention specialist, it's a speech language pathologist, it is an occupational therapist. It's any of those types of certified professionals. It is necessary, it is planned, designed, delivered, and the person delivering that measures the degree and the intensity that's required for the student to be for the student to make progress. So for instance, in a co-taught setting, the special education teacher takes the partnership lead in the planning, designing, and initial delivery and monitoring of the SDI outlined in the student's IEP. The general education teacher can support SDI after initial delivery by the special ed teacher. The general education teacher might replicate or extend SDI to provide generalization of targeted skills and behaviors in the general education environment. But it's key to note, paraprofessionals do not provide SDI because they are not certified teachers. Adequate training must be provided for paraprofessionals to function, for functions that are expected in the supported role, like reviewing or reinforcing skills or certain concepts. Our supplementary aids and services, these are what the student needs to get access to the general education curriculum. And it's indicated by student performance data. And it's based on student needs related to the disability for them to make progress towards their measurable annual goals. So given the adverse effect a student with a disability requires SAS, and this section may not be left blank. You may never write none needed. That's never an acceptable response, okay? So just make sure that you're paying careful attention to that. Students need SAS to advance, to be involved, and to be educated and participate with other students in the general curriculum. So here's a nice little chart, and I can include this for you in Padlet as well, comparing some SDI to some SAS. So explicit instruction in using graphic organizers, that's SDI, but graphic organizers themselves are an SAS. So modeling, tactile, kinesthetic tracing is going to be SDI. A scribe, like someone who's writing for the student, that's going to be an SAS. So you can kind of look down this kind of a list and see the difference between the mnemonic strategies are an SAS, but teaching it through direct instruction is going to be the SDI. So just be really, really clear about how that works. All right, with progress monitoring, what we can kind of look at a chart like this. We've got our goals, and then we have the information, A, B, C, D, E, F, and we have to collect data regularly and report that data out to other teachers and the parents, the families, the student, on how they're doing, what kind of progress they're making. So we're looking at these kinds of things, and this comes from an audit sheet, right? So that we can kind of have a checklist. If I was auditing your special education department, I would look and see. So I'd look at this progress monitoring data and say, is there an explanation of the extent, if any, to which the student won't participate in the general education curriculum? So yes or no. Did the admissions and release committee or the IEP committee consider potentially harmful effects of the placement on the student or other? So I'm kind of going to go down those things. And frequency of services, are all of these things present? That's kind of what that would look like. Just a key detail, the method that you use to establish your baseline performance in the present levels should be the same method that you use to monitor progress. It's comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So if you used a running record to get your baseline for reading fluency, then you need to use running records for your ongoing progress monitoring, and your goal needs to indicate that you are using running records for your progress monitoring. Your current baseline information has to align to the measurable annual goals. So if you've got a goal for behavior, then the present level should contain baseline data about behavior. And then your measurable annual goals shouldn't be written in any area in which current baseline information is not documented at the present levels. So if you've got a student with a learning disability, if their math performance isn't documented in present levels, they cannot have a math goal. If they need a math goal, then there needs to be information about that in the present levels, okay? So hopefully you can now explain the difference between the SDI and the SAS and look at some different SAS and know when to use them. I'll put another video where we do some examples with students shortly.